Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the show. Today, I am honored to have Dr. Cheri Mah with us. Dr. Mah is one of the most remarkable, not to mention renowned sleep scientists, and she is a true pioneer in the field of sleep, sports, and athletic performance. It is, trust me, no exaggeration that Dr. Mah's research at Stanford University on sleep, sleep extension, sleep restriction, sleep deprivation, circadian alignment, it has transformed our understanding of how sleep can enhance or impair athletic ability. She's a highly sought after advisor to some of the world's most remarkable sporting superstars and professional teams. I could go on and on. It is my absolute privilege to welcome her onto the show today. Dr. Mah, thank you for doing this, and hello and welcome to the show.
Great to be here. I'm so thrilled to get to have this conversation with you.
It's going to be fantastic, folks. Strap yourselves in. We are going to dive straight in. But before we get into some of the details of all of the science, perhaps tell me a little bit about your background. And for the listeners, tell us what exactly inspired you, firstly, to become a sleep researcher and clinician. And also, then, how did you start to focus on sleep and athletic performance?
Sure. So, my story, I will say, dates back over 20 years when I first got into the sleep field. I am from the Bay Area originally, and I went to Stanford for undergraduate. And I had the unique privilege to meet Dr. Dement, considered the father of modern sleep medicine. And he was a fascinating professor who really intrigued me in the field of sleep science. He started the field, as we know, in his early work in the 1950s, 1960s, and the field has grown out of that early work. And as a 17-year-old, I was able to be a part of what would then be my very first sleep study. And we were looking at how to pay back accumulated sleep debt in Stanford undergraduate students, looking at the impact on mood and reaction time, and really looking at not just over the course of one night, two nights of extended sleep opportunities, but over multiple weeks. And what happened was there was a couple of Stanford varsity swimmers in that study. They came into the lab one day and said, we know you're looking at the impact of sleep extension on our fatigue levels and on our cognitive reaction time, but I just want to let you know I set a couple personal records in my last swim meet. And that was sort of my aha moment that was so fascinating to me that, yes, maybe we might actually see some of these benefits manifest itself on physical performance. And so as a teenager, that was what I just was so fascinated by, because sleep is this interesting process that each of us do every single night, arguably not well for many of us. But what we were seeing in these top tier athletes was that maybe there actually were these benefits of paying back that accumulated debt. And so I tucked that away. I went through undergraduate work at Stanford, helping Dr. Dement teach his undergraduate course and doing some other studies. But it wasn't until I stayed to do my master's and I asked him, can we repeat that study specifically now in collegiate athletes? And he said, yes, go for it. And the study then became specifically looking at sleep extension in the Stanford men's basketball team. In a very neat way, over 5 to 7 weeks, we were showing that these athletes had an improvement in 9% of their free throw shots and a 9% increase in their 3-point percentages. They were sprinting faster, they were reacting more quickly. And that's really what captivated me to focus on sleep and sport. I think so much of the field had really elucidated more the negative consequences when we chronically don't get sufficient sleep. But this was sort of the other half of the story, right? Of what were the positive benefits that could result if we're more intentional about paying back accumulated sleep debt and having extended sleep opportunities. And that was what Dr. Dement and I would talk about, that this was something we wanted to dive into and really try to utilize collegiate athletes as our model system, right? Where clearly they are motivated by performance. They're more used to, on a regular basis, having their daily performance monitored. And it also matters for them when it comes down to tenth of a second or some of these very quick decisions. So that's really what led me down this road with sleep and sports. Not to mention, I just personally love sports, and it was a way to bridge that academic interest. And then really started to look at that across different teams at Stanford, and then branching from there, looking at circadian disruption and what that could look like for performance outcome. I came back for medicine as a later decision after I was doing more research and applied work. So ended up going up to the University of California, San Francisco for my medical training, and then stayed in San Francisco for residency. So I am board certified in internal medicine, and then came back down to Stanford to do my sleep medicine fellowship. So I'm board certified in sleep medicine. So that's my story of how I got into this fascinating world. It was a little circuitous, but I love it.
For every sleep scientist I've interviewed on this show, I think we all came through a circuitous route. You know, I often joke for myself that I was an accidental sleep scientist, that sleep, you kind of trip and stumble over it, and then you just fall in love with it. And that's it for the rest of one's life and career. And I think you've given a really nice, by the way, for folks listening, you can see based on that CV why, if Dr. Mah wasn't just such a wonderful person, you could imagine being deeply intimidated by her intellectual horsepower. But I think we've got a sense of sort of the high contour, 30,000 foot view already a little bit regarding what sleep can do for athletic performance based on that study, which I'll come back to because I really want to double click on it. But stepping maybe at that high contour level, just give us a TLDR. If you were to sort of be rounding out on an NPR show and you've got 60 seconds, 120 seconds, why is sleep particularly crucial for athletes? And maybe even what are the core areas of athletic performance that sleep can influence?
Sleep is so foundational, not just for these elite athletes, right? Even for you and I and other high performers. But in particular, I think the impact it has on your cognitive performance, your physiology, and your physical performance are three key areas that are particularly essential for elite athletes to be mindful of how their sleep is going to really impact these domains, because ultimately it's a combination of these areas that will help athletes peak when it matters most. So, what I mean in that is, for the cognitive performance, athletes need to make good decisions quickly under pressure. They need to react fast and accurately. Obviously, learning and memory is going to be key for skill consolidation, for them to be able to remember the playbook and actually execute. For their mental health, we could go on the cognitive domain. From the physiology, we need healthy athletes that are not injured. So we know sleep is so critical for proper immune function, for hormonal regulation. For athletes, appetite and weight management can be a key component of their training goals. Their muscle repair and recovery is essential, since they have such a high demand on their physical recovery day to day. And then even thinking about inflammation and the impact that their training, not just in season, but off season, can have, and the differences there. And then from a physical standpoint, we've already discussed a bit on the reaction time, but motor skills and what they're developing in terms of their motor skills is important. They are concerned about being accurate, what their power output is. We want to make sure that they have lower risk for injury, and are really, the end of the day, is trying to maximize the potential to have a long career. So to come back to these different domains, the cognitive physiology and the physical performance, it's really the intersection of these that sleep impacts every facet of these three domains. So I think the crucial point is that it's just an untapped area of performance enhancement, and it's not often fully leveraged, even at the top athletes. And so that's why I find it's just to be so fascinating, because I believe that there's this competitive advantage that's free and easily accessible and really readily available to anyone that wants it. It just does take time and effort and discipline, but the benefits will come down the line. And it's really the difference that it can make, is being on the podium or not.
And I love two things that you said there. First, I've often sort of quipped that I think sleep may be the greatest legal performance enhancing drug that not enough athletes are abusing in rude volume. But the
Exactly.
other sort of component that I love you mentioning there is the brain and the mind. When we think about athletes and training athletes, if you're to ask anyone on the street, myself, dilettante included, I would speak all about the body, muscle repair, physiology, energy balance, all of these things. I think we often forget that the brain can make and break an athlete as if not more powerfully and or quickly than changes in the body because as you said, making the correct decisions, having the correct mental state, having appropriate mood and emotional regulation and balance, concentration, focus, learning, memory, all of these things will feed into an athlete's performance in ways that I think even the athletic organizations typically neglect. And here, sleep is absolutely critical. We'll come back to that because you've done some great work there. But I want to return to this epic work. It's now a legendary study on collegiate basketball players that you described. Here you did this really clever sleep extension study because at the time in the field of sleep, and my work has been, I think, very clearly errorful in this same way. Most of us were studying what happens when you deprive people of sleep, when you restrict their sleep, when they're not getting enough sleep. You turned the coin and you asked, well, what happens when you extend their sleep? Not the bad things that happen when you don't get enough, the good things that happen when you get plentiful amounts. Tell us a little bit about what that study involved and what you were able to extract from this extension of sleep because there was all manner of things, shooting accuracy, performance, reaction times, sprint time. I mean, epic data. Tell us about that to really impress upon the listener how simple sleep extension transforms an athlete.
This was considered the Stanford men's basketball study, which, as I mentioned, I conducted during my master's. And it was the first team that I really examined. And I wanted to study how sleep extension over multiple weeks would impact specifically on court performance. And so we worked with the Stanford men's basketball team. This was over 2 seasons. I had the students that wanted to participate extend their sleep for 5 to 7 weeks. And that sounds like an incredibly long time, but the goal was to look at not just that short term extension of one night of good sleep or one weekend of good sleep, but my hypothesis was that it did take likely multiple weeks to really make the biggest impact on that accumulated debt. Since at the time, the thought was yes, you could pay back probably acute sleep loss, but whether or not longer term sleep loss could be, I think, was a little bit more and still is up in the air a bit. But really, we wanted to see over multiple weeks. And what we demonstrated was that after 5 to 7 weeks of sleep extension, where the athletes were trying to get 10 hours of sleep a night, which I know sounds a lot. They went from, I believe it was about 7.8 hours subjectively to 10.4 hours, is what they reported. We did have objective measures using actigraphy watches, which showed they went from 6.7 hours to about 8.5 hours. But the difference it made on court performance was 9% improvement in free throws, 9% improvement in 3-point shots, 12% faster reaction time, and a 4% faster sprint time. As well as when we looked at mood, there was lower fatigue levels and higher vigor levels. At the time, I really think it was the quantification that was novel. And I think highlighted that sleep, it's not just potentially providing a 1% improvement that so many athletes are trying every which way in every training aspect to separate themselves from the rest and get that 1% benefit. But this was showing, hey, maybe if you actually are more intentional with even your sleep duration to make sure you're not at a sleep deficit, there's a 9% benefit or arguably double digits perhaps that you could see that would be an investment of several weeks, but obviously that trade-off could be huge. And in a really neat way, I wanted to share one example what that looks like in real world. So Andre Iguodala at the Warriors, when I worked with him a couple of years ago, we really recrafted how he approached his sleep because he knew this was an area that he didn't do well, but actually asked for help because he wanted to have as long of a career as possible. He was 28 at the time, which is the average age for retirement, and knew that his end would be in the next couple of years at some point. But the difference that he experienced as we went from under 7 to 8 hours of sleep was a 9% improvement in his free throw percentage, which in a very neat way was the exact replication of the Stanford men's basketball study. He also had an improvement in his 3-point shooting percentage twofold. His points per minute went up 29% per minute. His turnovers went down 37%, fouls went down by 45%. In a neat way, that following year, the Warriors went to their first NBA championship. He got the finals MVP. And then even more fascinating to me is that I've been able to follow his career, and he's been very vocal about his sleep success and how that has impacted the subsequent years. And in the end, he's had 3 more championships and a 10-year longer career. So one of the quotes that
Mhm.
I love sharing is he said, "The sleep was helping me so much and it changed everything for me."
Isn't that remarkable that if you were to think about what you've just described, the same individual, the very same apparatus of this human being with all of the skill that they have, is not really the same individual. It depends also on sleep. And I don't know what it would mean. I wish I could sort of think about this and calculate it. But if that individual on less than 8 hours of sleep came into the NBA draft, what round would they be picked versus when they are getting 8 hours of sleep or more, they probably could be a first round pick versus a seventh round pick. I don't know what it actually would be, but that's the difference that we're talking about in terms of sleep. And based on those numbers and from the Stanford basketball study, if you were to come along to a team and say, we've got this new, it's not an energy drink, but it's a new performance drink. And if all of the players committed to consuming this across the season, you can expect these types of number improvements in their performance on average. Would you be interested in purchasing some of said performance drink? They
Exactly.
would be buying it in the gallon. They would be mainline IV infusing it. A long-standing partner of today's podcast is Element, spelled LMNT. Element is a sugar-free electrolyte mix. And for me, it was the sugar-free part of that made me start using it quite some time ago. Beyond having the electrolytes in the right balance, the other reason I'm a fan of Element is that it's scientific. And if you look at the people who created the company, you'll find some pretty heavy-hitting physiology, biochemistry, and pharmacology knowledge that is baked into the product. And again, all of that comes without any sugar. I am a devotee of their product. I really do use them. I know people will say that on these ad reads. I use it every single day for my workout. I put it in my protein shakes afterwards. I do use it. Also, by the way, Element has just recently brought back the chocolate medley range, which you can have essentially your electrolytes hot. And in the trio of flavors, there is chocolate mint, chocolate chai, and also my favorite, chocolate raspberry. And by the way, I happily badgered them to agree to give you fine folks a free sample pack with any purchase of Element if you just use the link lmnt.com/Matt Walker. That's lmnt.com/Matt Walker. One quick question that the audience may be pondering right now. Tell us exactly what is the difference in your mind between simply getting a good night's sleep versus sleep extension? What does it look like in practice in terms of an athlete? And you mentioned sort of the amount of extension that you're providing, but boots on the ground in the trenches, tell us about what it looks like to work with athletes to extend their sleep and how it's different from a good night?
Sure. So, sleep extension is obtaining more sleep than you habitually get daily. That was our specific definition for the athletes that were participating in the studies, where, as I mentioned, their typical sleep, so their baseline sleep was around 7.8 hours, and then they did substantially extend with the goal of 10 hours, although obviously objectively they were closer to about 8.5 hours. We really tried to have a consistent schedule when they were extending their sleep and maintaining still the same wake up time. We know that obviously is so critical to lock in your body clock in the morning. So we're really trying to also encourage this consistency in bedtime and wake time. I think in an application, I'm not necessarily recommending you go from 6 hours and try to get to 10 by any means. I think doing gradual increases of 30 minutes consistently this week, and then building to at least the minimum 7 hours, and then trying to experiment with going to 7.5 or to 8 and seeing how you feel when you wake up and how you function in the daytime is a better strategy in application. I do think that there's actually good strategy around when you might consider doing a sleep extension. We'll call it a protocol. For example, with some of my elite athletes, we focus in the off season to pay back accumulated sleep debt. And so, really, that would be a time when they can also make adjustments to some of their sleep habits, how they go about their daytime activities, because we know having sleep smart daytime choices really can affect your sleep at night. It's not just what you do in that hour before bed, but then also, right, being able to optimize that approach. So you're actually more intentional and proactive with how you're integrating sleep into your daily schedule. And then you're sleeping during the nighttime. But the off season can be usually one of my targets with elite athletes, because then you're putting in the most work when you often have the least stressors compared to the regular season. Really, this also sets yourself up for better success if you're coming into season with zero sleep debt, would be the goal, and really trying to maintain zero sleep debt through season. Now, the reality is life happens. It's a long season. And so usually you incorporate challenging factors like travel and jet lag on top of this. But you're at a better place if you're at zero sleep debt coming in to training camp in the beginning of the season and then making adjustments along the way. There's also opportunities for shorter periods of sleep extension as an intervention, for example, in a bye week in the NFL. Schedules are a little bit more relaxed. And so that might be a better period where athletes are able to focus on their sleep a little bit more intentionally than maybe other weeks. Or, for example, if an athlete is injured or on rehab, those are other specific periods where having an intervention like this, even if it's shorter than several weeks, could still potentially be beneficial.
I think this is such a good example for folks as to why Dr. Mah is so sought after. You're pragmatic in how you think about sleep rather than being puritanical. And I think I've certainly, as a public communicator, been too puritanical and not lived in the thing that you described, which was the real world. I lived in the ideal world and nobody lives there. So I love the pragmatic approach that you have. And I think it's one of the things that really defines you too. I want to very just quickly return to something you mentioned in the Stanford basketball team study, which was mood and emotion, because we've done a lot of basic science in the field of mood and emotional regulation with sleep. Tell me about how you think of mood in the context of athlete performance vis-a-vis sleep, things like mood, fatigue, vigor, and how that relates to performance metrics, all of which is to say, maybe is it the wrapper of that we would call mindset? And how does that play into your thinking and your practice with athletes?
Sleep definitely impacts mood, but mood also can impact sleep. As one example of bringing this back to the Stanford men's basketball study, we asked them to do self ratings in practice and then also in games. That in part would reflect what their mood state was, but also their mindset. And I think most athletes can resonate with how they feel in terms of readiness and this holistic readiness to practice, to train, and then to perform in game. The difference that was when we asked athletes at baseline with their normal sleep habits versus in the end when we were assessing after they had 5 to 7 weeks of sleep extension, the difference was in practice was an average rating of 6.9, and then they went to 8.8. And then in games from a 7.8 to an 8.8. Now, that may not sound like a lot of a difference, but to me it is, and to the athletes it was, right? The difference of being a mediocre 6 versus closer to a 9 in terms of your ability to train and to practice, and then in game your readiness at like a medium 7.8 versus closer to a 9 at an 8.8. I think that could actually make a huge difference. When you asked about vigor scores, right? So we did show that when looking at mood states, fatigue levels decreased, vigor or energy increased, and mood disturbance also improved. We know things like when you look at moods such as anxiety or stress or depression, these definitely can impact your sleep, from your onset latency to the total duration you're getting at nighttime to awakenings at night, and even obviously your sleep architecture with the different sleep stages. So I think this is applicable to everyone. We've all known a good night and a poor night and how that can affect our mood and how we interact with the world and with our family, friends, and coworkers. But it really is bi-directional.
And I would just ask anyone listening to that point, not just about how lack of sleep can impact your mood, but when you've woken up and you're off to the gym and you're just in a really bad mood or you're just really fatigued, I find it so hard to put in anything like a good workout. I almost know just from my mood state what my workout is going to be. And imagine if that's just me doing that recreationally versus me, that is my job. And I am a multi-million-dollar expensive unit in a large organization. The consequences from a perspective of disrupted mindset can be as deleterious as a disrupted body physiology. So that's why I love that aspect of your work. Coming on to then the challenges with sleep, I can well imagine there are countless different sleep issues that athletes will face. Maybe run us through the common ones that you have seen in your practice. And even if there are a number of them, do you actually get a sense from the athletes that they're an issue, that they see them as a problem?
All great questions. There are, I would say, a wide range of common sleep issues that I see with these athletes. And in part, some of them are sports specific, right? The NFL schedule looks very different than Major League Baseball schedule. The travel is very different, even the time of day when games are played. So there are sports specific challenges, but there's also common threads that run through elite athletes in general. So to start with, the racing mind. Racing mind is one of the most common issues that I see with my athletes. It's not just elite athletes, right? I think all of us experience this from time to time. And it's more with athletes that it's specific to games or competition. And it can occur often in advance of a game or competition, but also after. And this is something that I regularly discuss with athletes is strategies that they can actually implement on a regular basis to manage those thoughts and actually be more intentional to process their thoughts before they get into bed every day, on a good day and actually on a bad day. So they're really actually building a process that their brain and their body is accustomed to and utilizes this as part of their daily schedule and wind down. So that would be number one. I really love journaling. I also like a to-do list to give us time and space that athletes can process that information before they actually begin something that's relaxing as part of their wind down routine. Number two is just physiologically amping down post game. A lot of these athletes play very late in the evening time. And so they're very sympathetically driven. Their core temperature can be high.
And
It can
Cheri, when you say sympathetically driven, meaning the sort of fight or flight branch of the nervous system is overactive?
Exactly, right? They've played a game sometimes from 7 to 10 PM, bright lights, their fight or flight system is going to try and obviously play to the best of their ability, and it can take time for them to relax, to wind down physiologically, And some have strategies in place and many others don't. And so that is a common issue where it can take 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours for athletes to be able to feel like they're both cognitively and physiologically ready to sleep. But that can mean it could be 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning sometimes. And it's a huge challenge for a number of athletes. Number 3, switching from day to night games. That can be challenging on the body clock. And also in terms of how it affects their sleep schedule when they have to shift from a day schedule suddenly to a night schedule or vice versa. And then thinking about the rest of their day, that can also be contributing to challenges when they have to perform at a time that is very different than the day before. I would add, let's see, poor sleep. It's like cycles of poor sleep can occur. Again, this can be sometimes sport specific. As one example, if you're a pitcher in Major League Baseball, you pitch every 5 days. And so you can see sometimes these cycles where they sleep well for about 2 days. And then as they're leading into getting ready to pitch, then sometimes that night before or sometimes the day right after can be worse sleep for them. And so there's these interesting kind of micro cycles of sleep, even within an athlete's typical schedule. Caffeine definitely can be a contributor to sleep challenges. It's a performance enhancer for elite athletes. So I
Right.
recognize that and trying to figure out how to balance the need for it for their game performance, but also how does that impact then their subsequent sleep when they're trying to actually get the best recovery at nighttime. So those are some that I frequently see. And then you layer on travel, right? There's long bus rides for minor league players. Even at the highest level for the major league teams, there's on chartered flights, but you can arrive into cities at 3 or 4 in the morning. Their schedules are not always very consistent. You're experiencing jet lag when you cross multiple time zones. Teams often go to altitude, so altitude can affect your sleep. And then they're also often not always on the road for a long enough period where you want to be acclimating to specific time zones. And then you could be on the road for long stretches, and that can be over multiple cities. So these are all challenges that athletes typically experience that are some sport specific, but common threads as well.
A partner of today's podcast is Shopify. Why Shopify? As someone who spends his days researching sleep and his nights researching sleep, the idea of selling merchandise was quite daunting. And you're probably thinking, what on earth is he going to be selling? We're going to start with some exciting t-shirts, all with the proceedings going directly to a new sleep education nonprofit charity that I will announce later. At the moment that we started to do that, I knew what I wanted to design, but how on earth was I going to get this sleep merch into your fantastic hands? Everyone who gave me answers gave me the same answer, Shopify, and it turned out to be remarkably simple. Without any retail experience, I was able to set up and activate my store effortlessly. Shopify's point of sale system, it's really interesting. It basically just integrates perfectly with all of the different online sales components, and it just manages everything so smoothly. Honestly, it was great. Shopify POS, it handles all the complexities of sales, inventory, and it just lets me focus on my passion, which is sleep science. Try it out. You'll see what I mean about its intuitive platform. But you should also note that Shopify isn't just for online businesses. I've heard, at least from one friend in particular, it really can help revolutionize in-person sales as well. It's one system that seems to integrate everything. If you would like an offer, here is the offer. Shopify have agreed to do a $1 per month trial. It's just $1 a month if you do shopify.com/Matt Walker. So again, shopify.com/Matt Walker. You'll get Shopify for $1 a month. That's nuts. I don't know why they're doing this for me, but it's great. Okay, let's get back to the show. Are there any specific sleep disorders? Because certainly when I've worked with pro teams and individuals before, as I know that you do, we typically look to see, are there any risk factors that would signal the potential of a sleep disorder? How have you thought about approaching sleep disorders? Is it a common issue? What are the typical sleep disorders that you see? Why do they happen? How do they accept the idea of treatment? I'm fascinated. What's your experience there?
Yes, there are many sleep disorders, even in healthy, fit athletes. Sleep apnea is still one of the most common sleep disorders that I see in athletes. For those that are listening, if you're not familiar with sleep apnea, it is a very common sleep disorder where your airway can have some partial or full collapse. And then when this happens frequently throughout the nighttime, you can have very fragmented sleep and you're not getting that quality consolidation through the night. So individuals can wake up feeling unrefreshed. They can have an impact on their daytime functioning and feel sleepy, and it really can have long term health consequences. And so sleep apnea, I think, is one of the most underdiagnosed sleep disorders, even in my elite athletes. And I do try to be mindful of identifying those that are at higher risk so that we can actually get them tested and ultimately treated if needed. And I think that it's something that will continue to improve because currently, for many sports organizations, it's really dependent on the team to either screen for or to be able to identify these individuals. And there's not typically a systematic process for many to be able to help these athletes. And I think one example, if I can share with you, of why this can be so important is because it can be life changing and career saving. So one example I like to share is there's a NFL player, Ryan Jensen. He got cut from the Ravens a couple years ago when the story goes he lost some strength and his weight was not what it should have been. His dad called him out that he wasn't being himself, and I think he made his mom cry, is how the story goes. And
Well,
along the way, Ryan got diagnosed with sleep apnea, started on treatment with what's called CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure, and he really attributes that to saving his career. In a really neat way, 4 years later, after he started treatment, he signed a $42 million contract as the highest paid center in the NFL. And then several years later, 2021, he went to the Super Bowl with Tom Brady and they won. So I think just that huge swing of basically being cut from the Ravens to being a Super Bowl champion, hopefully there's more stories like this because they're inspiring and it really shows how much of a difference this can make if you address a sleep disorder like sleep apnea that is incredibly common. So I'm curious, Matt, if you can share some of your work with sports teams, or I think you've also been screening for sleep apnea with some of the players that you encountered.
yeah, we did. And I remember there was one NBA player that I will not name, but he was just feeling sluggish and said, it's not that this happened overnight. It just has accumulated over time. I just feel as though I'm degrading in my performance. The assumption was it's just age. Based on neck circumference size, based on some subjective reports, we did a sleep apnea screening, diagnosed, had quite severe sleep apnea, got them onto treatment, which was what we call a CPAP device, which is CPAP, and it stands for continuous positive airway pressure, little nasal pillow that pushes air up the nose. And essentially, it acts like a sort of an airway splint to prevent your airway from collapsing and therefore going under these sort of snoring and oxygen desaturation episodes. Got him treated. And I remember going back probably about 3 months afterwards. And I said, how's it going with the treatment? And be honest with me, do you feel any different? And he just looked at me straight and he said, even just from my mind alone, after you got me treated, it was almost as though you came along and you wiped a fogged window clear, and finally I could see again. And I just thought it was one of the most brilliant description lines. He just felt as though he was fogged, and he had just assumed this is me at this age and at this stage of my career. What was striking is that it wasn't. There was a better version of him sitting beneath. If
Mhm.
only you could remove the roadblock straitjacket of physiological impairment caused by his untreated obstructive sleep apnea. So I think it's a fascinating area. Also, I think it's good to keep in mind that we often in the field of medicine think of people who have sleep apnea as perhaps being overweight, inactive. It's not necessarily so. You can be of lean body mass and you can look very physically fit and you can still have obstructive sleep apnea. And I remember working with a Premier League player in terms of soccer in the United Kingdom who fit that profile exactly. And he was just very resistant for a while, saying, I thought it was just people who were overweight. They're the only ones who snore. And it took forever to sort of gradually just nudge him into saying, no, 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 don't worry. You're not strange. This is not me ridiculing you. There's no stigma associated with it. So you had to get over a lot of that front end. Once we did, goodness, he was grateful for it in terms of treatment, and it helped him, transformed his performance too. So I do think it's a big issue.
No, definitely. And I feel like, to your point of, many athletes, I think, get used to feeling like a walking zombie, and they think that that's normal, with or without sleep apnea, just even with insufficient sleep on a regular basis, and then you layer on apnea on top of that, they've often been untreated, probably for many years, really, until someone can identify it and really recommend to get evaluated. It's hard sometimes to convince athletes just how different life could be when you get either actually sufficient sleep for the first time or treat sleep apnea, because as you mentioned, it's not always the overweight individual. I see it plenty in healthy, fit athletes because it's a anatomic and mechanical issue many of the times. And so it's really the genes that mom and dad gifted you can put you at higher risk, but it can really not just save careers, it can be life changing.
Let me then move on to perhaps something we touched on there, where we're speaking about sleep issues and the sleep challenges. And there was a great study, maybe sort of back in 2018 or so, on sleep quality among college athletes. Tell us a little bit about what is the quality of sleep like in people who are at that high level of athletic performance, and perhaps what were the most significant or even striking findings there that you were obtaining? Because there's so many challenges that could disrupt sleep quality.
Definitely. This was a study I did at Stanford, really trying to assess the sleep health of the varsity athletes. I sat in the weight room for a couple of weeks and tried to capture as many athletes as possible. I think it ended up being a total of 628 varsity athletes across 29
My
varsity teams.
goodness.
Yeah, it was a fun study. But some of the main findings were that, unfortunately, we did identify many of the collegiate athletes would be classified as poor sleepers. So 42% of them would be classified as poor sleepers in the 628 athletes that I was able to include. They slept worse on campus than they did when they were traveling. And obviously, there's some factors that we could probably attribute to being on a collegiate campus and in the dorm life versus being on the road. Another finding was that 39% of these athletes were obtaining insufficient sleep, which we defined as less than 7 hours per night. Now, that's huge. That's obviously more than a third of the population was not getting the minimum that's recommended for every adult. And then that's not even factoring in where the expert recommendation is really that these elite athletes should be getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep every night. But the interesting part is that when we asked, well, how many hours of sleep do you think you need to perform optimally in school or sport work? 74% of the population said they knew they needed 8 to 10 or more hours. So
Hmm.
the difference between 39% actually getting under 7 hours and then 74% knowing they needed 8 to 10, right? That really highlights the discrepancy between the perception of what they know they need and then what they were actually able to get for themselves, whether that's
Talk about a
considering.
demand supply mismatch. If you,
Yeah,
um,
exactly. But we know this affects then how they're performing in the daytime. Half the population had high levels of daytime sleepiness. I think that was around 51%. And then it also then would translate to them feeling tired. So 62% said that they're often or always tired. And I think what's interesting when you look at the trends of the ages of the athletes, particularly the freshmen and sophomores, so the first year and second year into college, they definitely had worse sleep with the highest levels of daytime sleepiness. So I think that's an area then you can target in terms of education and better support for sleeping on campus, as well as just evaluating then the schedules from a system standpoint to actually be able to support sufficient sleep. And now this year with Stanford joining the ACC, I am actually curious to see how this is going to really impact athletes because my hypothesis is it's going to be much worse now that there's more
Yeah.
travel. There is going to be likely an impact on their sleep patterns as well as more time away from campus. And these results may be different, and I anticipate not to be in the positive direction.
Okay, time for some honesty. I've probably eaten more protein bars in my lifetime than I've actually blinked. They've been such a constant for me throughout my life. I recently found David protein bars, and it was my friend Dr. Peter Attia who raised awareness about David. He played a key role in the development of this really quite radical new protein bar. And just hearing it from Peter, knowing his standards, that's all I needed to at least consider making the switch. And then I read about the company. They are fantastic. The bars are built on a simple, groundbreaking concept: the fewest calories for the most amount of protein, period, ever. And each bar contains a wonderful 28 grams of protein at just 150 calories. They have 0 grams of sugar as well. That is the best protein to calorie ratio that has ever been seen in a protein bar. The taste, exceptional. I almost have to ration them. They're that good because I could probably inhale about 10 of them in one go. Protein, of course, by the way, it's critical. It's not just for building and maintaining muscles. It's for managing metabolic health, helping you feel fuller for longer. And it's that unique ratio that I think makes David protein bars, just for me at least, the most satiating that I've also ever experienced. They are fantastic. They've got 6 incredible flavors. And here's a bonus: when you buy 4 cartons, you get a 5th entirely free. If protein bars are your thing, even if they're not your thing and you're considering them, just go on over to davidprotein.com/Matt Walker. That's davidprotein.com/Matt Walker, and you will get a wonderful experience in terms of that bonus. Okay, back to the show.
I'm curious, Matt, what you think about some of these stats and obviously with your work, how you think might be impacting learning or memory, both in the classroom, on the field, and how you think maybe there's ways to apply what you've learned for these specific athletes.
Yeah, certainly we know that the disrupted sleep is not going to help them, firstly, from an academic perspective, because sleep, and particularly deep non-REM sleep, is essential for what we think of as textbook-like memory, learning of facts and being able to regurgitate them. What we've also found, however, is that for folks listening, memory isn't just memory, isn't just memory. There's lots of different systems of memory in your brain. One of them is textbook-like memory. The other is memory for skills, actions, and behaviors. So think about learning a surgical procedure, riding a bicycle, and, drumroll, athletic performance. And what we found there was something interesting, which is that practice doesn't make perfect. Certainly, as you're learning new motor skills and you're learning or you're perfecting and refining those motor skills, which are essentially what underlies much of the dynamics of athlete performance, practice certainly does get you a long way. And with practice, you get better. What's interesting, however, is that once you stop practicing, once you stop learning, your brain will continue to learn in the absence of any further practice. However, that delayed, what we call offline motor skill learning, only happens during sleep and not across equivalent time periods awake. So, in other words, it's not practice that makes perfect, but practice with a night of sleep that seems to lead to perfection. And we've understood the different types of sleep that are important for that type of motor skill memory improvement. We're finding that it's particularly a stage of sleep in non rapid eye movement, and particularly these bursts of electrical activity during non REM sleep called sleep spindles that seem to boost that motor skill athletic performance. Most of those sleep spindles really come in the second half of the night, and particularly the fast bursting ones come in the last couple of hours of the night. I bring that up just because you can think of that classic collegiate or professional coach who has their players practicing and on the field, maybe until the evening. And then the next morning, you're expected to, at the crack of dawn, be back on the field again because their assumption is that's what's good for performance. But what they're doing there, in essence, is shortchanging the athlete's brain of some learning potential by way of taking them out of those last couple of hours of really good motor skills sleep. So I've always found that, really fascinating. I've tried to present that data to coaches, but there's such an ingrained mentality of rise and grind in the athlete
Mhm.
and superstar performance world that I found it very difficult to change because for me, sleep has a stigma associated with it of being slothful or lazy, which even is still there present in the athlete world. Whereas when you think about training and you think about diet, those are very virtuous. People are very vocal about saying, I was in the gym 6 out of 7 days this past week, or I ate really well. I ate a really clean diet this week. I don't see many people being very vocal about how much sleep that they're getting because they're almost ashamed of it. So I think people like you and I, we face not just the challenge of getting people to change behavior, but it's a behavior that has a stigma associated with it. And we're trying to get them to increase it and even extend it. So, yes, it's important, but yes, it's also a challenge to try to change people's behavior. I don't know if you've come up with any Da Vinci Code special kind of language or tools to change people. I find it hard.
I think the tides are changing though, and I do think it is some of the elite athletes that are leading the way and as wonderful examples because I think 10 years ago, very few athletes were really vocal about how they were sleeping or that this was something that they were prioritizing. But over the last couple of years, right, I think there's the LeBrons who say, I need 12 hours of sleep,
Mm.
inclusive of his naps. There's Simone Biles who talks about needing 8 hours and how that is important for her mental health. There's the Tom Brady's who do everything around performance enhancement. And he says, I go to bed early because I do wake up early, but I do everything around trying to be different in the league. And he obviously had a very long career that was very successful. There was, Nadal, even years ago, he said, I need 8 to 9. And Federer, I think the story goes, he didn't really like to talk about his sleep because he thought actually it was such a competitive advantage. And I believe he
Yeah, I've
said
heard that
11
too.
to 12 hours is what he was getting.
Yeah,
But
he does. Yeah.
yeah, I think that there are these elite athletes that are now changing that stigma. I think we still have ways to go, but they're setting the example of what it really means to be at the best of your sport and how critical sleep has to be every day for you to have that consistency and to have as long of a career as possible.
So I've got just a few last quick questions on the absence of sleep and the deleterious effects, because sometimes we've spoken about sleep extension and how stellar it is and striking it is, but I do still want to speak about the negative consequences a little bit because often in the news, as they say, what bleeds leads. But we've been speaking about the disruption of sleep in athletes. I think one of the big challenges prior to your work was, well, but how do you quantify that? How do you assess that? Could you discuss a little bit about now your athlete sleep behavior questionnaire? Because I think it really plays into that concept, particularly for teams, coaches, players who are listening to this. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So the Athlete Sleep Behavior Questionnaire, this was a tool that I collaborated on with a couple other colleagues. And what we really wanted to develop was an easy questionnaire that coaches, staff, and even researchers could utilize to get a better pulse on the sleep health of their athletes, particularly these behaviors that could be maladaptive, so that you would have a way to identify and reassess how athletes' sleep health could be, especially if there were areas that could be intervened. And then you would have a tool to be able to reassess that at another point in the season. So this was done over 9 different countries, 18 different sports. I think there was around 564 participants. So we really tried to get a wide snapshot of different athletes across various elite programs and developed this to be able to identify maladaptive behaviors on an 18-item questionnaire. So those 18 items are common issues for many of these athletes that you would rate on a scale of never to always, and you would get a 1.25 point per item with a summation for a total global score. This was meant to just be quick, that you can do in 2 to 3 minutes and give us an idea of areas that potentially could be lower hanging fruit for either a staff or a coach to be able to intervene, and then be able to reassess that at another time point so that hopefully there were positive changes and then you would see the impact on sleep on the questionnaire as well.
That's a fantastic tool. Perhaps if it's okay with you, Dr. Ma, we will link to that questionnaire so folks out there in the performance world can download it and readily use it. I suspect it's a free tool that people can just download and get a bead on both their team and their individual.
Definitely. And it does differentiate between elite athletes. And so hopefully it becomes a valuable tool to quickly assess where you can make some positive changes for their athletes.
Brilliant. And as you said, it is so quick. It's a short questionnaire, but it gives some really, I think, fantastic detail. Everyone in the performance world is always short on time. So don't worry, folks. This is not any one of those extensive things. This is, you need it, you can get it, you can go. I'm going to try to fold my last couple of questions because I'm mindful of your time, but could you maybe turn the tides on sleep rather than extension? You've also looked at sleep loss and specifically sleep restriction and how it constricts the performance of an athlete, both in the short term and long term. Maybe tell us a little bit about some of that data. And from that and the work on sleep extension, I suppose a broader question would be to start to think about what are your recommendations for athletes in terms of minimum sleep requirements based on all of the empirical data. So I've just thrown a lot of spaghetti against the wall there, but tell me about sleep restriction and performance, either be it a sort of short term, long term, and then maybe overall, how much sleep do you think athletes should aim for?
Sure. So one study that I specifically looked at sleep loss was looking at actually multiple days of insufficient sleep and how that potentially could impact performance outcomes and specifically biomechanical changes. Now, the background to this is that we know when individuals are chronically not getting sufficient sleep, you're at a higher risk for injury. But that mechanism of why is not very clearly known. And there, to my knowledge, hadn't been studies looking at active athletes. When I did the study, the situation was really, we're like, I'm not sure, in my lab, we've ever had a biomechanist and like a sleep researcher in the same room. But hey, why don't we do a collaborative study to really try and understand what potentially could be happening with biomechanical changes? Because maybe that actually is contributing to higher injury risk. And so what we examined was looking at 3 days of getting 4 hours of sleep a night, which is obviously not maybe too out of the norm of what could happen for an athlete. And then really examined more specific relationships between the hip and the knee in specific orientations, and found that there was increased in the variability of these coordination patterns after the sleep restriction. So, what that means is that athletes were not choosing their preferred coordination pattern that we assume should be consistent if you're well rested. And so this therefore potentially could have an impact on performance outcome, which we did show there was a decrement in their maximal vertical jump by almost 2 centimeters. And I know 2 centimeters doesn't sound like a big difference, but 4 centimeters can be the difference between being drafted in the NFL versus being not drafted. So these small
Wow.
changes can have huge outcomes and impact on careers and, and performance. And really, the increase in that joint coordination variability we also saw was associated with a slower reaction time, which we knew likely would occur. But the bottom line is that this may actually be part of the mechanism of what is happening that athletes could be at higher risk for injury. This was a small exploratory study, so much more to come, but I think it was the first to really show in active athletes a dynamic movement that is so common, like a vertical jump. So that was one I'll highlight on how we know that short term sleep loss really can affect performance and perhaps getting at an underlying mechanism. When you go for a much longer term chronic sleep loss, I think we are really looking at just the suboptimal state, not just for performance, but you're just chronically fighting this added weight from sleep debt that can physiologically impact our proper functioning of muscle recovery, appetite, inflammation, decision making, memory consolidation, everything that we've discussed prior. So it's that added work. But the bottom line is you just arguably aren't at your best cognitively, physiologically, physically performing at what would be optimal. And when you repeatedly experience this, it can accumulate over time. From a long term standpoint, I think actually Chris Winter's data looking at MLB longevity as sleepiness increased, although it's a snapshot in time, as athletes were more sleepy, fewer were in the league even 3 years later. And so I think longevity can be curtailed for a lot of athletes. And then you layer on top risk for injury can curtail a career even more so. And I think that when you're asking how much an elite athlete should get, the expert recommendation is yes, 8 to 10 hours that they should be maintaining on a regular basis. I've shared strategically paying back that sleep in the off season is typically more ideal than when you're in season. You should gradually work up to that. If you're someone who's getting 6 hours of sleep, I recommend 15 or 30 minutes more until you at least hit 7 hours as the bare minimum for daily sufficient sleep. But you can experiment because you may actually need 7.5 or 8 hours to feel refreshed when you wake up and to maintain good daytime functioning. And we have to remember it's not just about duration, right? It's about the quality of
Yeah,
your sleep and also the
good point.
timing of your sleep. So that's where I would say for all the listeners is start small and gradual and build from there.
I love this idea of crawl, walk, run approach. It almost reminds me of the literature, and I think you're clearly so well versed in it regarding behavioral change. If you ask someone to do something and it's a Herculean leap, they just fail, they won't adhere, and they'll never do it. But work, I think, by folks there at Stanford, like BJ Fogg, trying to get someone, let's say, to floss their teeth. If you just say, every night we're going to have you floss your entire mouth, do this, and people who are not doing it, they just don't start. They do a very clever thing where they say, okay, tonight and for the next week, all we want you to do is floss your front two teeth and don't do anything more. You absolutely can't do anything more, just your front two teeth. And you just make it a manageable thing. And of course, people then start to maybe do a few more. And it's this lovely kind of progression. And I think it's so important when it comes to sleep. And I've certainly learned my lesson there. Speaking about then strategies just in closing, if you were to get into an elevator and maybe there is the coach of one of the top MBA teams and they look at you and they say, oh my goodness, you're Dr. Ma, I've got to go to a meeting. I've got about 3 more floors to travel. What are your top 3 sleep strategies or tips that you would tell me to gift like an edict to my athletes and perhaps even non-athletes to optimize their sleep and performance? What would you perhaps say in terms of practical closing suggestions of sleep strategies?
I have many more than three, Dr. Walker, but I will
I
end
love it. This
there.
show is a long form show. If you've got 30, we've got time. I love it. Go for it.
No, we'll start with three. So, number one, I do really recommend evaluating your sleep environment. I think that can be less than optimal for a lot of athletes. both at home and on the road. So you want your environment to be like a cave, really dark, quiet, cool, around 60 to 67 degrees, comfortable, and also consistent. Now, this can be challenging with travel. So, part of that, I do recommend investing in sleep tools. So, I build a travel sleep kit for a lot of my athletes. It has adjustable eye mask, light blocking stickers for those devices in the hotel rooms, curtain clips to keep the curtains actually closed, silicone earplugs to have the ability to block out unwanted noise, travel white noise machines so you can mask over external noises on the road, having a journal, bringing your own pillow, chamomile tea for a wind down. There's more in there, but having those tools readily available, I think, can be so helpful because you never can always control your environment. And especially if you're on a flight or trying to take a nap in a place that is less than ideal. So, investing in sleep tools, I think, can be incredibly helpful. And then having a wind down routine and being intentional with managing racing thoughts every day. So even on good days and on days where it's more stressful, you at least have a process and routine that your brain and your body can anticipate. And so you build that into your regular schedule so that you become more proactive with your sleep and less reactive. So to close, I will say my last tip and strategy is really to think of sleep not as the end of today, but to think of sleep as the beginning of tomorrow. And that is, in my opinion, a very small but powerful shift in mindset of how you think about your sleep, because everything that you invest tonight will ultimately impact how you are tomorrow.
It's so well said. And I do probably a lot more work with high level operators in the business world in terms of sort of concierge coaching. And that's in some ways orthogonal to the way I frame it too, which is sleep is not necessarily a debt on today or a cost to your today. Think of it as an investment in tomorrow. And it really does transact. You know, it's one of the best forms of physiological injected venture capital that you could wish for in terms of you and your business. And I think that's exactly what you're saying here, but in the guise of physical performance. Dr. Mah, you are exceptional. I am sure this is going to produce a ton of love and questions, and I suspect we're going to have you back. But in closing, where can people find you on this thing called the interwebs? Tell me about websites, IG, X, LinkedIn, Facebook, website. Lay it out for us, and we'll also include it in the show notes. Where can people find you?
Definitely. If you want to learn more, you can follow me on Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn at Dr. Cheri Mah. So DrCherimah. Or you can go to my website, drcherimah.com.
Again, that is www.drcherimah.com. Dr. Mah, thank you so much for joining us. What a dispensation of informationally actionable, rich content. You're brilliant in the way that you do it. You're brilliant in the way that you have researched this field, but you're also brilliant because you're a pragmatic operator. We need to have many more sleep scientists who are becoming out there in the world and transacting this and becoming sleep practitioners, not simply just sleep researchers. You are, I think, the poster child for that, for joining us, for sharing your wisdom, for all that you do. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, folks, take care. Bye for now. We will see you in the next episode.
Sleep well.